Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 5 months since my last YouTube video. Hey, everybody. I'm back. I have one other video on this channel, so I'm sure I was sorely missed by a lot of people. But as you can see, I went to school. And for all of first semester, I was living with a roommate, which is why I didn't really have the space to make any more videos. But I've had some ideas percolating in the back of my brain. Percolating? In between now and then, I have consumed a lot of media, a lot of shows. One of the ones that stood out to me the most was Andor Season 2, I finally watched. I know it's been out for a while, but I hadn't gotten around to seeing it. And for someone who had completely written off Disney Star Wars shows, it was a total game changer. But it brought something to mind. And for anybody who knows me, they'll know, much to their frustration sometimes, that I have an opinion about the show South Park that maybe most people don't share. And I don't mean that in a, oh, I'm so different kind of way, but just genuinely, it's almost frustrating the amount of conversations I have with people who defend that show. And it sort of got me thinking about the different ways that shows and media portray social commentary, or try to deliver social commentary is maybe a better way to say that. Because I had problems with it on its face before I watched Andor, but after seeing Andor and also seeing a show like Ted Lasso, which is a show that I watched somewhat recently, when there are shows like this out there that demonstrate social commentary in such an understandable yet raw and empathetic way, it really highlighted some things that I think the South Park series has done very poorly. And I'm not trying to say that South Park is an evil show or that you should, feel shame or stop watching it. I don't think that's true at all. But my primary criticism is this. People who watch South Park, people who engage with South Park, especially people who say that they engage with South Park for the social commentary, often walk away from it with this nihilistic, everyone's wrong sort of opinion, sort of view of the world almost. And I don't think that's a product of the cultural moment we live in. This show's been running since, the 90s? And it's kind of always been like that, from what I understand. I think mostly what this comes from is the show's sort of thesis. The creators of the show have said their goal isn't to take sides or to push any specific political agenda, but it's more to attack bad arguments. Now, on its face, I think this is a pretty understandable, if not bordering on admirable goal. For a long time, the US and places around the world have had this idea that the media, right, the press, our freedom of speech is meant to be used as a watchdog for the government, the sort of people in power. We have this ability. It's a right for us because we are meant to use it to speak out when something bad is happening. So a really generous reading of this show's goal would be it wants to be a nonpartisan, equal opportunity offender, which sort of reveals my hand, but it wants to attack people who are making bad arguments or doing bad things or believing foolish things more than it wants to push a specific agenda. And again, on its face, this is a fine idea. In fact, I would even, encourage this in a vacuum, not knowing what I know about South Park. But the issue with this approach is twofold. One, the issue with this approach, I think, is twofold. And I think that the specific way that South Park has chosen to execute it also adds another sort of problematic layer to the proverbial onion, so to speak. The first issue is that this is not actually a truly neutral viewpoint, especially when you're trying to do satire or sarcasm. You have to be very careful to walk a very specific line so that you're not actually pushing the message of inaction or almost like nihilism, not like as an insult, but just like this idea culturally, politically, that nothing you do matters because everybody's opinion is dumb, right? And second, I think this leads to a semi-frequent, almost false equivalence, which makes sense if you're approaching it from the perspective of wanting to point out maybe that no single person or no single side of an issue has 100% correct or perfect ideas, right? That's totally true. But what tends to happen, I feel, is that it ignores the fact that different sides of issues tend to come at it with different power levels, right? So trying to tear down or ridicule the message of a multi-billionaire with an entire campaign behind him is going to have much less of an effect on his ability to get the word out or change people's opinions than it is if you're attacking somebody who's in a minority or a deprivileged group, right? So if you present these two arguments as equal, then try to tear into both of them the same amount, or, make people generally think they're both stupid. Well, one side of the issue has the resources to combat that, the other side doesn't. You actually are inadvertently helping keep status quo power structures in place. And again, I don't think that's the goal of the show. I don't think they have some secret agenda to push billionaire propaganda on us, but I think that it is an unfortunate side effect of what I mentioned earlier, this show's specific execution of its thesis, which is everything is insult first, sarcasm dripping, and shock content. Because at the end of the day, this is a TV show. And it's been running for decades at this point. It's one of the most popular, well-known TV shows that there is. They have to keep upping the ante season after season to get people to come back and keep watching, right? Which is hard to do when your entire brand is shock and spectacle, right? So pretty much my thesis, or the point, is this. South Park, while they didn't invent this sort of edgelord style insult for social commentary, I think they definitely popularized it, and I think they definitely use it in a way that does a disservice to the material they're actually trying to address, and reduces the value of the show's social commentary as a whole. But hold up, I hear you saying, a lot of people are going to critique Mitchell. Have you actually seen any episodes of South Park? Because if you haven't, you are not in a place to criticize this. And to that, I would respond with, that is an excellent point. Up to this point, no, I have not seen any full episodes of South Park. And you're absolutely right that it would be disingenuous of me to disparage the show based off of just YouTube clips that I've seen. So in order to make myself as impartial and knowledgeable as possible on the subject, I actually have watched 2 episodes of South Park. The first one I chose to watch is Season 8, Episode 8, which is Giant Douche versus Turd Sandwich. Now, I'm not going to cut up the show and put clips of it in here. Maybe if I was better, I would do that, but I am going to give a quick little plot rundown just to show, 1, I actually did watch it, and 2, for people who maybe haven't necessarily seen this episode, even though I've heard it's a pretty popular one. There's a few different plot threads at work in this episode, but basically the rundown is this. The South Park Elementary School, they are attacked attacked isn't the right word. They are harassed, invaded. PETA bursts into their school spirit assembly where they're all getting ready for some sports ball game later on in the week. And they harass and chastise the students for having a cow as a mascot. This eventually leads the school to decide, hey, we need to change the mascot because PETA keeps harassing us. And this is kind of what I like to call the sub commentary layer in this episode, right? The PETA thing. I don't know if these PETA people are recurring characters. Spoiler alert, at the end of the episode, they all get killed off. So I don't know if they come back or if this is just a this episode thing. But despite the fact that they start the episode out, they're not really the source of the main point of criticism in this episode. Basically, the school decides they're going to take a vote among the students to see what the most popular replacement mascot is. And for some reason, this elementary school decides it's a good idea to give the students ballots with a write-in form instead of just putting generic options on there. I should mention there's a little jab thrown in about how they could choose the Indians or the Redskins because PETA doesn't care about people, which I thought was pretty funny. But essentially, one of the characters, Kyle, says that he thinks this whole thing is dumb, that they are, giving in to the eco-terrorists of PETA, and decides he's going to start a writing campaign to get people to put giant douche on the ballot. And the sort of inciting incident of the episode is that Eric Cartman, another one of the characters, basically steals his idea and then says we should do turd sandwich instead. Stick with me. I know this is boring. I'm speed running the rest of this. Their friend Stan is in this little group going to be the tiebreaker between whether they decide to campaign for Giant Douche or Turd Sandwich. He decides the whole thing's dumb and he walks away. Basically, both Giant Douche and Turd Sandwich end up getting nominated to run, but that's not really the point. The point is Stan is refusing to vote. People in his life are trying to convince him to vote. They're pointing out that it's like a civic duty or whatever, you know, a lot of the things you hear from people at election time. And he is saying, why would I vote if my only options are a douche or a turd sandwich? At one point, what he says, and this is later on in the episode, he says, it's not that I think voting is bad. It's just that I don't care this time because the options are a giant douche and a turd sandwich. No, that's pretty much the episode. People are kind of harassing Stan, just trying to get him to vote. He gets banished. There's a little bit of a jab thrown at PETA in there. It basically implies that they fuck animals. You know, if you find that sort of thing funny, that's great. But at the end, Stan ends up voting. He conforms for social reasons, and he does end up just randomly picking someone to vote for. Now, this episode was trying to do a lot, especially to work with just the 20 minutes of runtime that they're allotted for like a network television show, right? I can appreciate that. There were some funny bits in there about soliciting people who are undecided voters and basically just bribing them.
Oh, really? Well, that's interesting. You certainly should think about it and make the right decision. Butterscotch candy?
And at one point, like the douche and the turd sandwich have a debate and they both dodge questions and just basically attack their opponent instead of actually answering the debate questions, right? And I can appreciate that. But these are things that I would also put in the sort of secondary point category of this episode, right? They're not necessarily the primary concern, even though I'm sure the South Park creators do want to throw jabs at politicians and the way that people bribe undecided voters. From what I sort of saw or interpreted, the main point of the show was just pointing out or almost mocking people who want to use voting and think it's going to make a difference, right? Or believe that it's like a civic duty or a highly important process. Now, I think one point of nuance that this episode was actually missing is that most people understand that not voting or voting for a third party is in itself a vote. It is sort of a way that people express their voice, and people actually do track how many people don't vote in each election versus how many, third party votes they get. And that is a real thing people look at. That is a real metric that does influence the way that politicians do things. It's not, the one everybody cares about, but it does carry some weight. But the show is guilty a little bit also of this sort of fallacy of begging the question where its conclusion is hidden in the premise, right? So there is no point in this episode in which Stan debates or thinks about the policy differences between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, right? He, at the end, just kind of randomly picks one. There's no internal reasoning given for, okay, well, I gotta pick turd sandwich because even though neither of them are good options, this one is going to hurt these people less, or it's going to advance these policies or have these benefits, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, he's severely uninformed and just picks one to fit in for social reasons. And this has a very specific effect. It leaves this episode with a very surface level understanding of the issue, right? It just criticizes people who want or try to force other people to vote with no exploration of what you should do or what the alternatives to this situation are. Stan, who doesn't care, is given platitudes by people around him who all want him to vote because there is a social pressure to vote and voice, your opinion in that way. And that is true. And at the end of the episode, he just randomly picks to be accepted and unbanished from South Park, I suppose. And there's a lot of ways you could take this, but none of them are actionable or really helpful. For instance, let's say that your takeaway from this is that actually Stan is the example of someone who's doing something wrong and just making an uninformed voting decision for social reasons to fit in. Well, okay, but there were no consequences to that. The school doesn't go to shit because I think a turd sandwich one in the end was elected. There are no real repercussions to him picking an uninformed person to vote for, which is not true in real life. When you vote uninformed for social reasons, there are absolutely very real consequences. And it would have been an interesting avenue to explore that and maybe have Stan grow and gain political awareness as he realizes, oh, he voted for the wrong person and he should have done more research. Or if you walk away from this thinking that Stan's original take was right and that the people around him were wrong for making him vote, well, I mean, what does that say? Does that say this sort of political apathy is just okay and that, like, cool people don't vote? Or, cool people don't have opinions on politics, I guess? No, I would say if you took that away from it, I don't think that's what the show is trying to say. And there are probably other ways you could take this that I'm missing, but I just don't see any scenario in which the content of this show portrays a message other than, look at this aspect of culture, isn't it stupid? The fact that it doesn't take a stance isn't actually a strength in this scenario. It's a weakness because it doesn't say anything. It's essentially like saying, I think that's dumb. And so this sort of commentary without real constructive or actionable criticism is basically just plot. It's just pop culture. It's so people watching it will go, hey, that happens to me, or hey, I know that person. But if you really dig into it, it's not really something that people can use to make change or to make anything better. So if you think about it, what that actually pushes or encourages people to do, especially people who maybe are not especially media literate or who aren't, trying to spend all their time in the afternoon picking apart what this show is saying, it actually just encourages disaction. It encourages separation and detachment from these processes. And I don't think that's a good thing. The second episode that I chose to cover is called Go God Go. I watched both parts 1 and 2. I believe it's season 10, episode 12 and 13. And the sort of central commentary on this one is surrounding people who identify or push either as an evolutionist or a creationist. Basically, the inciting incident in this episode is that Ms. Garrison is instructed to teach evolution in the classroom, despite the fact that Ms. Garrison believes in creation and in God, and she thinks that that's dumb. So she teaches it not very well and sort of maliciously, and so they call in Richard Dawkins to help her teach evolution. Now, there is some sort of some passing commentary on teaching evolution in school and whatnot, but that's actually really not sort of the central point of this episode. Although I'll come back to that later. A bunch of stuff happens to Eric, but all that stuff is not really very interesting or relevant to the actual critique as far as I can tell. Most of what's relevant is what happens to the people around him. They're all fighting because they can't agree on the most logical scientific answer to the great question, and the twist is that the great question is just, what should we call atheists? Anyway, as I understand it, the point that the show is trying to make is, even if you successfully eliminated all religion, which Richard Dawkins does, people would still fight over pointless things. And then there's sort of a double twist in the ending where Eric changes time again. Religion never gets demolished. But the twist is that they're just fighting in land disputes with the Africans over Hawaii, which I thought was actually a pretty funny twist. Anyway, the point of this episode being, as far as I can tell, that everybody who identifies with an ism is, somehow in the wrong. In the sense that neither of them should necessarily push what they believe, because in the end, it doesn't matter who wins. Everybody's still going to be fighting pointless wars, right? So they should ostensibly kind of stop caring, or this pushing either side is dumb narrative, which goes back to kind of the last point I was making, that sort of condemning both sides, refusing to take a stance thing that South Park is well known for. But more importantly, I think it also speaks to the second point I mentioned earlier, that being that this sort of gives an equal weight and equal validity to both the Christian side of this argument and the atheist side of this argument, right? As if these are two opposing forces with equally weighted beliefs that are both stupid, because that's the point of the show, right? It wants to point out that both of these are stupid, but in doing so, it overlooks a lot of nuance. I'll use the example of evolution in school to sort of flesh this out. And I know that this isn't the main point that the show was trying to critique, or at least I don't think it was. But the sort of proposed position of the atheists is that evolution should be taught in schools because, the Bible's all nonsense. And the proposed position of the Christians is that the Bible and creationism should be taught in schools because, that's, it's the only true thing. When in reality, yes, a lot of atheists, but also a lot of rational religious people would absolutely agree that we should do our best to keep religious influence out of public infrastructure, out of the government. We have like separation of church and state as sort of a governmental policy for that reason, because people inherently realize that if you allow things like religion into the government, they can very quickly be used as a tool to oppress people who aren't of that religion, right? Especially if the religion is dominant, those people would constitute a minority in some sense, right? You put that next to the Christian position, which is that their religious beliefs should be taught in schools, and you have a clear violation of the separation of church and state, which actively pushes one religion onto young people, which is likely to make them ostracize or oppress people of other religions or people that don't agree with them. And so I'm not trying to make points specifically about evolution in schools. Mostly what I'm getting at here is the side fighting to prop up the separation of church and state is fighting to prop up a system that makes people equal, even people who don't necessarily agree with them. They're fighting for a system that gives equal opportunities to minorities, people of different religions that aren't culturally dominant in America. They're fighting to give them a seat at the table, right? In general. And the people on the Christian side of the argument are fighting specifically to push their religious beliefs into and across the boundary of the separation of church and state. This is more of an oppressor-oppressed relationship than it necessarily is two equal but opposite sides of an argument, right? And the sort of comparison made in the episode, throughout the episode, is this atheism versus Christianity debate, and how like there's still going to be wars and people are going to fight if everybody is atheist, right? I've been carefully putting atheist or Christian point of view in quotes this whole time because it's kind of a misnomer. The two views that are actually opposing here, like again, an example would be in this evolution in school debate, is this sort of Christian nationalist position and the everybody else position, right? Which is specifically a subset of Christianity that says, okay, we should push this on everybody and everybody should believe this, versus the other side, everybody else, which contains a lot of Christians, a lot of people of different religions, yes, a lot of atheists, a lot of agnostics, but it's more than just one part of one group of people, right? And a lot of this is shown or portrayed this way because this whole atheist versus Christian debate is something that was kind of made up by Christians as a little bit of a persecution narrative. And I'm not saying that there aren't any atheists out there that are trying to convert Christians, but what I am saying is Christianity has a holy book which specifically says, like on a systemic level, you need to spread this to as many people as possible. And atheism isn't a belief. It's not a religion. It doesn't have a holy book. It doesn't have like messianic figures or instructions. If, atheists are trying to deconvert Christians, then those are just assholes. Don't get me wrong. They happen to be atheist assholes. This isn't some sort of no true Scotsman. It's not like, oh, they can't be atheists if they're assholes, but it's kind of unrelated. Whereas I don't think you can ever really say somebody who's trying to push this Christian nationalist agenda, it's unrelated to their faith. Even though there are other people with their faith who maybe don't push that same agenda, it's still in the book, right? It's still more likely to breed that sort of response. Anyway, this episode's takeaway that all the isms, right, are stupid, it kind of inherently assigns an equal validity to both the separation of church and state side of things and the like religious nationalist side of things, when those two things are just not the same. They're just not comparable. It's not like they're two opposite opinions on how we should solve any given issue. One of them is you should follow my opinion, the religious nationalist one. And one of them is we should give everybody room to develop their own opinions and have a voice, which would be the separation of church and state side. Which is why I think this episode's specific comparison of atheism and Christianity it's kind of an apples and oranges comparison. But in order to mock both of these sides, which is the sort of hallmark of this show, it equates them. It doesn't really address that nuance, and that could lead to some very dangerous lapses in judgment from people who take this show influentially, from people who watch this show for the social commentary, which is a real thing I hear people say quite frequently. And look, I have to address the fact that I aside from the social commentary, I do not like this show. I don't particularly jive with the art style. I don't really like the mission of the show in the way it's executed. I like it theoretically, but and I also just really don't appreciate the sense of humor that this show has. And I think it's totally fine if you do. I think different people can like different things, but I think the value of the show really does not lie in its social commentary. I think the social commentary aspects that this show pushes or promotes are actually neutral to bordering on negative. It's totally fine to watch this show for pop culture reasons. They make episodes quick, so they cover topical things. And if you like the way that they cover, politicians and celebrities, then I could totally see why you would like to watch it. But we just have to be honest with ourselves here that this is not some like cutting edge social commentary, change the political landscape show. It's keeping up with the Kardashians for people who like cartoons. It's a show you can watch to say, oh, I remember that happening, or I know that person, or look at this funny thing this person's doing, which is fine. That's fine. That's entertainment. There's entertainment value in that, but it's just not that deep. I mean, this is a show where, like, in one of the episodes I saw, kids just, like, shit piles of gold, and, like, people get their heads blown off. The PETA guys get their heads blown off. This is shock value content. And I think there's totally value to shock value content. I'm a fan of The Boys, and I would say that's another show that definitely just kind of pushes these not so great social commentary norms under the guise of like, oh, look, we called out this guy. We sure are calling out these people, without really giving much actionable criticism or explanation as to why it's wrong. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to give you some examples of a different show that I think does what this show should do much better. I think Andor, specifically season 2, gives some really compelling neutral insight into sort of systemic issues, right? How they happen and what you can do about them in a way that also helps you feel empathy for people that you might otherwise consider your enemies. Now, I have to be fair. The episodes of South Park that I watched were about 20 minutes each. Each episode of Andor is 40 to 50 minutes, right? So I'm specifically going to compare elements from Go God Go, which was a 2-episode series, so about 40 total minutes, to an episode of Andor that I think is the most specifically relevant in this case. But it's worth pointing out, there's more total runtime of South Park, like way more, than there is of a show like Andor. So if you're going to invest time into regularly watching South Park, you're probably going to end up spending more time watching South Park than you would if you watched Andor. The episode that I have in mind is season 2, episode 8 of Andor. It's called Who Are You? Spoilers for Andor coming up. And if you haven't seen it, I seriously cannot recommend checking it out enough. But basically, this is the episode where we actually see the Gorman Massacre. It's the episode where a lot of threads from the first part of season 2 come to a head, right? And we start to actually see the sort of inner workings of the struggle between the Empire and the Rebellion and how they actually do play out. There is obviously some creative and plot liberty taken with the actual, like subterfuge elements of the plot, and Cyril kind of playing double agent. But more importantly, everybody in this episode is actually questioning their moral framework at some point, and a lot of them even come to consider why it's wrong. Also importantly, something that this show does is it doesn't just necessarily tell us that these are two sides, right? The rebellion representing fighting for people's rights, fighting to give them a chance, and then the Empire representing, pushing the status quo, pushing the one agenda on everybody, sort of parallel to the two sides in the South Park episode. But it actually shows through the Gorman Massacre how the oppressor side, the Empire, can utilize this dynamic and people who push this dynamic to actually manufacture consent to oppress the people that they want to oppress by othering them through the media. Literally creates consent in the population of the galaxy for the Empire to invade Gorman and just start killing people in the streets, calling them violent insurrectionists. I'm sure there's some parallels you could draw to the modern day political climate too. So right off the bat, we already have a more compelling, more useful, meaty social commentary in Andor than we did in South Park, because it shows not only this dynamic in its whole, but it also shows the outcome and the consequence of this dynamic on innocent people. We have Andor and his friend, I think his name is Will, on the rebel side, talking about the cost that their actions are going to have, and how taking this sort of decisive action against the Empire is going to get a reaction from them. They're aware that they're going to bring down sort of the hammer of the Empire on them if they keep up on this path. And then on the Empire side, we have Cyril and Dedra, who are also actively questioning their positions. Cyril is realizing for the first time that the Empire doesn't care about him. Like this thing he's dedicated his whole life to, he's just a number in the machine to them. And this sort of culminates for him when he has the chance to kill Cassian Andor, and Cassian just doesn't even know who he is. But he becomes so disillusioned with what's happened on Gorman that he essentially storms out of the safety of the Imperial office. We get to watch people actually confront the moral frames of their realities, and that inspires in the audience the thought of, okay, what if I'm the bad guy, right? What if I'm the Emperor? What if I'm the desk jockey working for the Empire, and the system I'm working for is actually oppressing and taking advantage of these people, right? It's not always that direct, but it actually inspires and starts that thought in you. So instead of saying, oh, well, people who ally with the rebellion or with the Empire are stupid and nothing's going to change anyway, it inspires this sense of, I need to examine what I'm doing and I can do better. And you might say, okay, it doesn't inspire that in literally everybody, but that's the intention behind this show, is not to show how stupid the conflict is and how naive people are for caring, but instead to show there are real consequences to this, and to hopefully get people to think about what they're actually supporting before they support it. I'm not going to go too deep into it because it has been a while since I watched Ted Lasso, but as I was watching South Park, the most striking difference that I sort of recognized is Ted Lasso is able to take these more interpersonal social aspects, right? Aspects about like relationships, sexuality, people's pride, and sort of this like toxic masculinity thing, right? It's able to disable and dismantle those narratives while showing you a better alternative without tearing down any characters, right? When the show critiques a character, it does so through showing that what they did was wrong, but also explaining their motivations for it, so you feel empathy for the character. It offers such a nuanced take on this sort of commentary that is really lacking in South Park, right? And there are a lot of jokes and a lot of funny moments in Ted Lasso, but it's able to do that without taking kind of pot shots at people based off their characteristics. Like something I noticed about South Park with Miss Garrison a lot, the show makes a lot of jokes at trans people's expense. Like with the episode Go God Go of South Park that I watched specifically, I noticed Miss Garrison's body was kind of a joke point for the show. Like there's one scene where her breasts are exposed, and the joke is like, oh, look, how can this guy not know that Miss Garrison is trans? Her breasts are so ugly. And it's just kind of a cheap shot. Trans people really struggle with body dysmorphia issues, and that sort of thing, it really doesn't help. So I think the payoff of the joke just tends really not to be worth the potential harm it could cause. And I know the episode I watched was made in 2006. It was a different political climate back then. I'm willing to grant that. I'm not necessarily saying this condemns the whole show and you shouldn't watch it. I'm just saying Ted Lasso doesn't really make any jokes at any character's expense. It makes a lot of really funny jokes based on circumstance and stuff, but there's no joke where the joke is just like, oh, haha, look at how ugly this person is, or oh, haha, look at how wrong this person is. It's always, look at the silly thing this person is doing, or look at the funny dynamic that came out of this conversation, right? If I had to wrap this all up, put a bow on it, make a summary, I would say it's totally fine to like South Park. I think South Park has a lot of, like, it does have some funny jokes in it, and I think there are good things that it has to say. I don't think the messages are all bad. I just think it shouldn't really be viewed as a primary source of social commentary. I think there are much better, deeper ways to give you social commentary that inspire empathy and passion rather than sort of inaction and disconnection that the South Park fence-sitting nihilism kind of causes. Now, there's the argument to be made that a lot of people don't want to watch shows that require you to get intellectually invested, and they just want to toss something on while they eat. I want to address that in a future video. I don't necessarily see that as a good thing, and I don't see shows or forms of media that would propagate that as a good thing either. But I mean, that's a valid point, right? If you're just looking for something to throw on in the background, you're not going to pay too much attention to it. South Park's great for that. If you're just looking for something that's going to make pop culture references, you know, South Park is wonderful for that. If you're looking for a bunch of little kids making fart sounds, South Park is great for that. But if you're looking for actual, like, hard-hitting, cutting social commentary that actually helps you grow as a person, I just don't think South Park is that. And I think that people who bring South Park to that sort of conversation really come at it with a frame of mind that you have to dismantle before you can actually get them to a helpful place. Also, and I'm not saying it's all, but a lot of people who watch South Park, I think, take joy in the fact that some of the, like, more shock value humor offends some people. And don't get me wrong, I love pissing people off, but I love pissing people off by being authentic. If my authentic self makes someone else mad, I think that that's kind of funny, right? There's a difference between pissing someone off by being authentic and pissing someone off by essentially trolling and rage baiting. And South Park does a little bit of that. Like, I'm pretty sure it would be hard for anybody to argue that there's no part of South Park that's made just to stir up controversy. And I really think if, for you, what makes that show interesting is identifying with something controversial, you probably need to take a step back, look at, like, yourself as a person, and then realize that your worth doesn't come from aligning with or not aligning with some particular culture. That's just armchair psychology, though. I'm not a psychiatrist, so take or leave that opinion. Anyway, that's my rant. Thank you for watching. If you made it through this whole video, I'm not sure how long it will be, but it will probably be pretty long. Leave a comment or a like if you want to see more. I am hoping to post more to my channel this year. So stay tuned, and I will see you next time.